Final verification of condition, paragraph 15 of the RPA. Buyer shall have the right to make a final verification of the property within 5 days. Now we'll read the rest in a second. So this should sort of be conforming or match up with the day you also expect the seller to move out. And you might want to set up, ideally a buyer would want to set up the final verification after the seller moves out. So damage sometimes happens when moving couches through doors. Frequently people leave a lot of stuff in the garage till they can actually move everything out. And all sorts of things happen in practical circumstances or in real life that aren't necessarily covered perfectly by this agreement because things don't always go so smoothly as the seller moves out 4 days before and then you do your verification 3 days before and everything's perfect. That doesn't always happen. So now you're working on mechanisms to help out the situation, and they can get a little more difficult. There are forms that cover some of the things. One of the things would be maybe having $1,000 left in escrow to make sure certain things happen. Of course, then it becomes a problem. What if the seller says he left things perfectly and the buyer says, no, this damage that your couch made to the floor is significant. I mean, things can come up, and that's why lawyers are frequently involved. But let's not worry about that right now. Let's assume that the buyer and the buyer's agent, the seller's agents are communicating well, and we're setting all this up. And maybe it's not a problem if escrow gets delayed if closing gets delayed a few days to accommodate the move-out schedule. I mean, a lot of things can be worked out with communication. However, sometimes they can't. And at that point in time, sometimes the seller has to play really hardball. Like, because buyers, they might have, I'll give a story in another video. It's going to take too long, but I'll give stories about how this is important. Basically, sometimes the seller just has to play hardball in the closing and say it has to be done. Because sometimes buyers will move into the property, and then the seller, it might be another week or two before the lender closes and funds, and it gets into escrow. And without that pressure on the lender, it may never happen. So sometimes the seller has to play hardball. We'll go into that in other videos, though. Now, this is an important point here. This verification is not as a contingency of the sale, but solely to confirm property is maintained pursuant to 11, which means the property hasn't changed from when the offer was made. It's still in good shape, the same condition. Repairs have been completed as agreed. Seller has complied with seller's other obligations under this agreement. The way I read this, not as a contingency of the sale, means that even if the buyer doesn't like the condition of the property, he still has to go through with the purchase. But in practice, that theoretical problem doesn't really have to happen because a buyer can say, well, I'm not closing till it's fixed. And at some point, something's going to give and things are going to get worked out. If the buyer really doesn't want to move into the property and the seller's not willing to repair or put it back in the condition that the buyer thinks is appropriate, I'd say at that point you probably want to bring some lawyers into this because it can get difficult. Hopefully, though, the buyer and the seller and their agents can work out all those concerns.